Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the IISS for this presentation and the launch of the latest Adelphi Arctic opening, Insecurity and Opportunity. Global warming is leading to seasonal sea ice retreat in the Arctic region, which in turn opens hitherto impassable shipping routes and new areas for resource exploitation. Such changes are elevating the Arctic's geostrategic value and stoking interstate competition. As the Russian Deputy Prime Minister Dmitry Rogozin said only this week, this is obvious, it is in plain view because the amount of resources in the world is dwindling and the struggle for them, for access to them, will intensify. Many players that are very strong, muscle-bound and broad-shouldered are eager to enter. So we will have to set up a whole system of protection, an arsenal of tools in the Arctic region to protect our interests, above all, our national economic interests. The admission of 5 Asian states as Arctic Council members, observers in 2013 underlines the increased importance of the High North in global politics, and as the sea ice retreats, so military forces are redeployed northwards, raising the prospect of conflict. Our speakers today are Christian Lumiere, ISS Senior Fellow for Naval Forces and Maritime Security, and Dr. Jeffrey Mazo, ISS Consulting Senior Fellow for Environmental Security and Science Policy and the Consulting Editor of Survival. Their book and their presentations today address change in the Arctic, outlining the possibilities and limits to economic opportunities, while providing an examination of the political and military changes this might bring. Jeff.
The Arctic is a moving target. The High North is changing rapidly in political, economic, and physical terms. Since Christian and I finished writing our book last autumn, and even since it was sent to the printers in December, there have been a number of significant events. I'll mention just 3 of them. First, the seizure by Russian security forces of the Greenpeace-operated Arctic Sunrise near an oil platform in the Petchoras Sea, the detention and charging of 30 activists and journalists and their subsequent release. Second, the government of Greenland has awarded the first oil and gas exploration licenses in the East Greenland Sea. And third, Canada deferred its expected filing with the UN Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf with regard to its extended continental shelf in the Arctic Ocean, leading to renewed concerns in some quarters about conflict between Canada and Russia with regard to sovereignty over or ownership of the North Pole. Rapid change and the risk of being overtaken by events is not unique to the Arctic by any means. But what is unique about the region, for the moment at least, is that the political and economic changes are driven by changes to the physical environment, as the Arctic warms twice as fast as the rest of the world. In the book, we focus not on such short-term events and developments, although each of them does illustrate some of the challenges we identify and discuss, but we focus rather on strategic trends over the medium term. Confident predictions can be made on the direction of some of those strategic trends, particularly the effects of climate change, even if specific forecasts are impossible. This in turn suggests that increased human activity in extractive resources, tourism, maritime industries, and military and paramilitary deployments is likely. It is impossible to predict with any degree of accuracy how much of the Arctic will be navigable, for what period of time, by what date, which resources can and will be extracted, and how much, or which military assets will be moved northwards or newly deployed in the region. Nevertheless, the geostrategic importance of the Arctic is increasing, and the issues of the Arctic are no longer confined to the High North, but affect the whole world. In the book, we go into what's happening in the Arctic in terms of warming and environmental change in some detail, but I'll just touch on some of the conclusions quickly. The Arctic sea ice is declining rapidly, and the Arctic Ocean is likely to become effectively ice-free for at least part of the summer, sometime between 2020 and 2050. However, it's important to remember that a given patch of ocean is considered to be ice-free, even if 15% of it is covered with drift ice. An ice-free Arctic Ocean will still be a uniquely harsh, difficult, and dangerous operating environment. Moreover, conditions will continue to vary significantly from year to year, as they do now. Finally, while warming will increase maritime access in the Arctic, it will make land-based access and operations more difficult and have widespread negative impacts such as changes to precipitation and runoff patterns, release of contaminants frozen in the ice, and the disruption of ecosystems. The strategic and security issues facing the High North, which are the focus of our book, all stem from the economic opportunities that we expect as a result of the slow but steady opening of the region. First, just a quick comment on what we mean when we talk about the Arctic. The common definition of the Arctic as a region north of the Arctic Circle has the virtues of precision and familiarity, but in many contexts it's arbitrary and it obscures some important differences and similarities. Some scientific disciplines define the region by climate, for example, the 10-degree July isotherm, by ecosystems, by human factors such as languages or cultures or peoples, or by subnational political boundaries. For an interdisciplinary analysis such as ours, a compromise is necessary. Just as an example of why these differences matter, 2 million people live above the Arctic Circle. 4 million people live in the Arctic as defined by the Arctic Human Development Report, which is the definition that we adopt. What definition you choose of the Arctic can determine whether Russia has 50% of the Arctic population or 75% of the Arctic population. So it does make a big difference. For the most part, as I said, we adopt the 2004 Arctic Human Development Report's definition for both theoretical and practical reasons, but we do focus on a more restricted area north of the Arctic Circle where warming will lead to the greatest physical and strategic developments. The economic opportunities opened up by the warming Arctic include increased tourism, fisheries, mining, forestry, and some specialized high-tech industries. We touch on all of these in the book, but I'll focus now on the two most important, to which we devote the most attention. These are energy and shipping. The Arctic currently accounts for about 10% of global oil production and 25% of gas, almost all of which comes from Russia or Alaska. The United States Geological Survey estimated in 2008 that the region north of the Arctic Circle contains 90 billion barrels of oil and 1.67 trillion cubic feet of gas, or 13% of the world's undiscovered oil and 30% of the undiscovered gas. This headline figure, which many of you will have heard before, since it's the only real estimate that's available, is nevertheless based not on hard data, but on a probabilistic assessment that amounts to little more than an extremely highly educated guess. Moreover, the 90 billion barrel figure that you hear is only an average estimate. The 90% confidence range, that is, there's a 90% chance that what's out there will fall anywhere between 44 and 157 billion barrels. The estimate also pertains to technologically recoverable oil, but doesn't take into account the economics of actually getting it out. 70% of the estimated undiscovered resources are restricted to 5 geological provinces, which you can see on this map. I don't know if you can see the hash marks very well from where you're sitting, but it's mostly north of Alaska and Canada, 2 sections off of Greenland, and 2 provinces in northern Russia. Current exploratory activity is confined to those 5 provinces, and until last month, when the Russian field in the Pechora Sea went online for the first time, production had been confined to areas like the Barents Sea, north of Norway, where development had already been going on for several decades. The difficulties of exploiting the energy resources in the Arctic include the distance to markets and suppliers, a lack of infrastructure, seasonal restrictions on operations due to ice and extreme weather conditions, a lack of daylight in winter, and onshore transportation difficulties due to surface thawing in summer, the high cost of labor, uncertainty about the long-term price of oil and gas, and stringent national environmental regulations. The limited progress in the development of hydrocarbons in the Arctic to date the limited progress that has been made has more to do with advances in technology and techniques and to global energy prices than it has to any increased accessibility due to climate change. The USGS concluded in 2008 that oil resources, although important to the interests of the Arctic countries, are probably not sufficient to substantially shift the current geographic pattern of world oil production. It's also important to note that the concept of a race for resources in the Arctic is undermined by the fact that 90 to 95% of these estimated undiscovered energy resources fall in national territorial waters or undisputed, already demarcated exclusive economic zones. While companies and states may be eager to exploit these resources sooner rather than later, the lack of competition among states makes it unnecessary to exploit them first before another actor gets there. With regard to shipping, convention has it that there are 3 sea routes in the Arctic. These are marked on the map: the Northwest Passage, the Transpolar Passage, and the Northeast Passage or Northern Sea Route. If and when these routes become consistently open to maritime traffic, even if only seasonally, they can provide significant economic benefits, shortening distances and transit times between Northern Pacific and European ports in particular. Currently, the Transpolar Passage is only navigable by heavy icebreakers or submarines, and the other 2 passages are only open in the summer, and inconsistently at that. Only the Northern Sea Route has seen significant commercial activity, and even there, the volume of shipping we've seen in the last few years has not reached the levels it saw during the 1980s, and has only recovered to the level that existed in the 1960s. Given the large number of unknowns, it's impossible to project the timing and degree to which Arctic maritime shipping routes will become globally significant and competitive with present alternatives. That they will do so at all is not inevitable, even as the sea ice progressively declines. The distance savings, and it can be as much as 40% over the Suez or the Cape of Good Hope routes for ports in Northeast Asia to Europe. These distance savings do not automatically translate into savings in time or money. Critical economic drivers such as fuel costs and politically driven factors such as user fees for the Northern Sea Route and investments in coastal infrastructure, search and rescue capabilities, and new icebreakers will be important. Shipping between Arctic ports, between 2 ports within the Arctic itself, and bulk shipping from the Arctic to non-Arctic destinations, especially of hydrocarbons, are likely to see the greatest and the earliest increases in traffic. Trans-Arctic shipping is likely to see much slower growth, especially for container ships. But by mid-century, it's likely that both intra- and trans-Arctic maritime activity will be at least an order of magnitude greater than at present, but will still pale in comparison with routes such as Suez and the Cape. Thus, although there are commercial opportunities in the Arctic, they are not necessarily as lucrative or revolutionary as is sometimes suggested. But even these relatively modest and incremental opportunities for economic development and exploitation of the Arctic mean that Arctic states are placing increasing strategic importance on the region. I'll hand over now to Christian, who will discuss military, paramilitary, and constabulary activity in the Arctic, as well as issues of geopolitics and governance that arise from the opening of the region.
Thanks, Jeff. And let me say it's wonderful to see so many familiar faces here, people who we have discussed the Arctic with or liaised with on the various topics of the Arctic. I think what Jeff's presentation demonstrated was that while the Arctic will open up, it needs to be placed into the context of wider regional and global economic factors that might mean assessments should be more cautious than they currently are on the opportunities in the north. Similarly, the issue of military activity in the high north should also be placed in the context of a variety of different factors, such as the post-Cold War peace dividend, the factors of ungoverned space in the north. So while there is a gradual militarization of the high north, and there is a very slow build-up of some military forces, it's not clear that there is what might be more sensationally called a Cold War underway in the high north. In fact, the Arctic has been a theatre for military operations for more than a century. We saw operations in the Arctic during the Napoleonic Wars, for instance, certainly during the First World War, Second World War, and particularly during the Cold War, where the Arctic was the primary theatre of operations for regular ballistic missile submarine patrols, both by the Soviet Union and the US, because the ice cover could provide for greater deception from anti-submarine warfare vessels or satellites. So the Arctic as a theatre of military operations is certainly nothing new. We are seeing a very slight militarization of the Arctic through a variety of different procurement programs and presences. Just last year, for instance, Russia inducted the first ballistic missile submarine it's built for more than 20 years into the Northern Fleet. It's announced that it will place a motor rifle brigade up in Pechenga, and also last year, in a very dramatic form of gunboat diplomacy, it sent a 10-ship flotilla to Novosibirsk, the New Siberia Islands in the Arctic, which is that top left photo there. which was led by one of its major surface combatants. So there is a sense that Arctic countries, particularly Russia, but others as well, are keen to secure their Arctic presence and economic opportunities through a greater military presence. And obviously the quote from Deputy Prime Minister Rogozin that Nick just mentioned demonstrates there's also rhetoric backing up some of this military presence as well. It's not just Russia, obviously. Canada, for instance, has in a very high-profile way outlined its desire to build between 6 and 8 Arctic offshore patrol vessels, which is what we see there in the top right and a mock-up. Countries such as Norway, which has benefited from oil wealth, has been able to invest in greater naval capabilities, such as the Fridtjof Nansen vessels there in the bottom left. And countries such as Denmark have also invested in vessels such as the Ivar Haltfeld frigates that we see in the bottom right there. So there is money going into naval vessels and procurement programs that are key to northern countries' security and military operations. There is a greater focus on the Arctic as well, as demonstrated by, for instance, a greater presence such as Canada's creation of 3 rolling exercises since 2007 in the High North, or Norway's movement of its joint headquarters from, and you'll have to excuse my Norwegian pronunciation, from Jøtta to Bordeaux in 2009. There are Norwegians in the audience who will mock me later for that. But I think it's important to put these procurement programs and these greater levels of presence into context of a longer history and the current situation. And particularly the fact that in the post-Cold War era, we saw significant and in many cases massive declines in defense spending, defense procurement, and defense personnel levels. In Norway, for instance, defense spending as a percentage of GDP declined from about 3.3% in 1991 to about 1.4% in 2011, indicating the fact that defense became less of a priority once the threat of the Soviet Union was eliminated. Sweden similarly saw defense spending as a percentage of GDP fall from 2.5% to about 1.1%, not without some criticism from serving officers and the fact that Russian planes that flew near to the Swedish boundary late last year had to be intercepted by NATO aircraft rather than by Swedish aircraft was a sign that Sweden may be unable to field the kind of forces it deems necessary for its defense. But nonetheless, it is indicative of the fact that Scandinavian countries in particular have had different priorities rather than defense spending. Personnel cuts in Scandinavia have also been very dramatic, reducing active serving personnel to about a third or half the size as they were at the end of the Cold War, and reserves an even greater percentage as well. So we've seen significant reductions in military spending and military procurement, not just in Scandinavia. In Russia, obviously, we saw a massive fall in defense spending from the end of the Cold War till about the late 1990s, and the only first real-term spending increase came in 1999. The defense spending of Russia, while significantly more than it was at the turn of the century, is still only about half of it was during the end of the Cold War. North American countries are also suffering from a variety of austerity measures at the moment that is affecting defense. So within that context, if we look at Russia's recapitalization of its fleet, we can also see that there are significant procurement programs such as the Yuri Dolgoruki ballistic missile submarine, such as new frigates and corvettes. But firstly, they're not entirely concentrated on the Northern Fleet. In fact, other fleets, such as the Pacific and the Baltic and the Black Sea Flotilla, are seeing greater investment, arguably, in assets than the Northern Fleet has been, and there is a general balance away from the North, despite rhetoric around the Arctic. And equally, the level of Arctic presence and activity is a pale shadow of what it was during the Cold War. We include this graphic in the book, which is a demonstration of exactly how low Russian activity has been in the Arctic in terms of submarine patrols. There used to be regular ballistic missile and nuclear submarine patrols under the ice of the Arctic, and now it's just in the low single figures. In 2002, there were no ballistic missile submarine patrols whatsoever, which for a country that wants to maintain a continuous strategic deterrence is obviously a worrying factor. Yes, there is a remilitarization of some form and a recapitalization, but it's very much of a lower level than we've seen in the Cold War, and it's increasing in Russia from a very low base. North American countries equally have a limited presence in the Arctic. The US has no naval bases in Alaska and no bases of any form in the Arctic Circle whatsoever. Canada largely relies on its rangers for its Arctic presence up in the high north, which are very capable forces, but not necessarily frontline troops, as one might expect. And the Scandinavian programs that we talked about before, such as the Fridtjof Nansens and the Ivar Haltfeldt, aren't actually ice-capable or ice-strengthened vessels. So they are unable or maybe unfit to operate in anything beyond first-year ice or even in first-year ice. Given this context of a limited presence and a gradual remilitarization that is seeking to govern very vast spaces that are now opening up in the Arctic, there is also the issue of a sense of cooperation being fostered amongst the various countries. So not only are we not really seeing state-based military competition of a very high level involving many action-reaction dynamics, but we're also seeing an attempt by various countries in the Arctic to develop military-to-military relations to manage any potential tensions that might exist. And we see that through exercises such as the Pomor exercises that Norway and Russia have held since 2010, the Northern Eagle exercises that Russia and the US have held since 2004 and have included Norway since 2008, the Chiefs of Defence meeting that's occurred twice now in 2012 and 2013 of the Arctic states as well, and more informal gatherings such as the Arctic Security Forces Roundtable, which members of the audience have attended here, which is aimed at developing a dialogue and increasing cooperation in particularly maritime security affairs in the Arctic. Now, some of these might suffer from what some believe to be Russian intransigence or a lack of communication or a lack of shared strategic goals, but equally they are demonstrative of the growth in military-to-military relations in the region. So while we point out that there is this element and sense of cooperation amongst the militaries in the north, we also would urge caution in that there is currently no security architecture in the high north to embed these long-term trends. The Arctic Council deliberately and specifically omits security and military issues from its remit and from its mandate, and there is no other overarching security architecture mechanism that would allow for management of disputes and greater cooperation in times of greater stress. So the short-term trends of cooperation are not necessarily guaranteed in the long term, and it's also possible that the Arctic could be seen as an outlet for other various tensions that might exist between Russia and NATO, for instance, particularly if it's decided to deploy greater ballistic missile defense capabilities up in the Arctic around Greenland. So a sense of cooperation in the short term, but not necessarily guaranteed in the long term. There is one area where greater cooperation could occur, and that is in the paramilitary law enforcement constabulary roles. But the problem here is that countries have very varying agencies, capabilities, and priorities for their law enforcement and constabulary roles. The US Coast Guard, for instance, is really the lead agency in the US for Arctic operations, but it only has one operable icebreaker currently, and replacements are being dogged by austerity issues and various political problems as well. And the closest deep water port in Alaska is actually more than 1,000 miles away from the most northern town of Barrow in Alaska as well. So we're talking about vast distances and great ungoverned spaces here with very few assets to be able to secure them, even in the constabulary world. The Canadian Coast Guard has a much larger icebreaker fleet, but has no permanent presence in the Arctic Circle either. Norway has a very robust and, in many ways, militarized Coast Guard, but Denmark has no Coast Guard whatsoever. Iceland has no military, but only a very small Coast Guard, and Greenland has no maritime assets with which to secure its maritime domain whatsoever. Slightly against this trend of very varying Coast Guard and law enforcement capabilities is Russia's extremely robust paramilitary capabilities in the FSB, and it's the FSB we see here that were involved in the operation to prevent Greenpeace activists from taking over a rig in the Arctic. But equally, while Russia has these very robust law enforcement and paramilitary assets, there is no formal negotiation or collaboration mechanism between the various coast guards and law enforcement agencies in the north. There are factors, there are fora such as the North Pacific Coast Guard Forum or the North Atlantic Coast Guard Forum, which include the various Arctic states, but there's no Arctic-specific Coast Guard Forum. So while the two agreements that we've seen in the Arctic Council in 2011 and 2013 were focused on maritime security and law enforcement, there's been no greater push to develop a wider law enforcement mechanism or architecture to, again, embed this potential sense of cooperation that could exist, and the various priorities and capabilities makes it very difficult to see that happening in the short term. So the context here is one of very gradual militarization, but one that is a pale shadow of that of the Cold War, but equally a lack of political will to develop the law enforcement collaboration mechanisms that would fill that gap, being left by a lack of security architecture. But while there may not be very much military or paramilitary competition, there is certainly geopolitical competition in the Arctic as well. And this stems from a variety of different factors. One is obviously the sense that there are economic opportunities to be gained, but equally there is no great competition over those economic opportunities in any particular sovereign or territorial waters or EEZs. But areas such as Greenland, which are rich in various minerals, will and are seeing the kind of economic competition that one would expect to see around that kind of exploration. There's also a lack of cohesion amongst the Arctic states, not just between Russia and NATO, but also among the NATO states or NATO partners in the region who disagree with the level of NATO presence that should be in the High North. And there's a slight rift between what we might call the Arctic 5 and the Arctic 8. The Arctic 5 being the littoral countries of the Arctic Ocean, and the Arctic 8 including Sweden, Finland, and Iceland as well, which was exemplified by the Ilulissat Declaration in 2008. Since then, the Arctic Council has emerged as the primary forum through which the Arctic countries as a cohesive whole will discuss the various issues of the Arctic. But there is still a sense that the Arctic 5 are keener to demonstrate their regulation and jurisdiction over particularly the ocean and fisheries within the ocean, and the Arctic 8 are slightly excluded from that competition, from that conversation. So there is a lack of cohesion in some sense in some strategic goals, and a level of competition even among the Arctic states that has been exacerbated by the inclusion of various countries in economic competition in the Arctic, but also as observer states to the Arctic Council, which we saw the addition of 6 states in May 2013 as permanent observers, 5 of them Asian, which demonstrated not only the Arctic's global role, but also the increasing desire for non-Arctic states to be involved in the conversation around the Arctic as well. Of perhaps greatest interest to various states, not just Arctic but elsewhere, was the inclusion of China, which has demonstrated its desire to be involved in Arctic discussions, continues to call itself a near-Arctic state to demonstrate its interest in the Arctic, and was involved in a somewhat controversial investment decision within Iceland for a large tract of land which was denied, and continues to be involved in discussions over exploitation of minerals in Greenland, which again raises political issues over migration. So the influence of China on the Arctic has been one of investment that is eliciting concern amongst Arctic states over potentially unwanted and unnecessarily influence. That has in turn inspired countries such as Japan to increase their influence over the Arctic conversation and apply for Arctic Council membership, observership as well. But equally, countries such as South Korea, Singapore, and India, major maritime nations, are also interested in keeping their hand in the discussion around the Arctic Council, even if they are unable to provide feedback into actually Arctic Council decisions whatsoever. So what we've seen in the Arctic Council with the inclusion of these 6 states and various other permanent observers that already existed is that the Arctic is now a global issue, even if the Arctic Council will still jealously guard jurisdiction over regulatory and supervisory issues in the region. There is a sense of competition, geopolitically speaking, particularly over the weaker members of the Arctic Council or weaker substates such as Greenland and potentially Iceland as well, where we see small populations with potentially large economic exploitation opportunities. In the book, we try to bring together these various facets of economic exploitation, militarization of a vague form, paramilitary, lack of collaboration, and geopolitical competition, and the development of governance in the region, and define the Arctic region as a zone of uncertainty in some sense, in that the pace of change is unclear, even if the direction of change is very clear in the region. And so it's currently unclear exactly how economically exploitable the various assets will be. We define it as a zone of confrontation to a certain extent, in that there is geopolitical competition and gradual militarization. But we also emphasize that currently it is much more a zone of cooperation than confrontation in both just law enforcement through the Arctic Council agreements, in environmental sustainability, and in some sense in military-to-military relations as well. But one of the major factors we draw upon is the lack of a security architecture in the Arctic, which means these cooperative trends can't be guaranteed for the long term, and there still remains a possibility that the Arctic will be utilized as an outlet for other tensions, not just in the tensions that already exist in the region itself.
Christian, thank you very much. Turn to questions. If you'd like to ask one, please raise your hand. Gentleman at the back, please. Just wait a moment, the microphone will come to you.
Thank you, Christian. Fascinating. I have a question about concern of a future architecture, because the Arctic Chiefs Council was established informally. Of course, it derives from the Arctic Council, but because of the because of the Ottawa Declaration, of course, cannot deal with matters of military security. Constabulary issues were allowed with the search and rescue and the oil spill agreements. And the Arctic Chiefs was not, as far as I understand it, a NATO project simply to prevent a Russian allergic reaction. I was wondering whether you see NATO perhaps taking a role in the future in trying to institutionalize this as part of perhaps NATO-Russia dialogue, or whether another international organization could provide the institutional basis for this, for such an architecture. Thanks.
Propose actually to take them in threes. So can we have gentleman at the front, please, and Nicholas McLean as well. Just a moment. Just wait for the mic. Thanks.
Hi, my name's Granville Byford. I think this question probably goes to Jeffrey. Could you give some rough estimate of the incremental cost of building a merchant ship with some sort of ice survival capability?
Certain countries have got great expertise in Antarctic conditions, and is there any relevance to the development of the Arctic? I know that Britain is one of those with a long tradition in the Antarctic.
Thank you. Christian,
yes, I mean, I'll speak on the first two briefly, and maybe Jeff can take the third. On NATO and institutionalizing various forms of collaboration, we don't currently see it as very likely that NATO will increase its role in the region. I believe personally, and I think Jeff would agree, that the Arctic is potentially a great opportunity for NATO or NATO members to increase their collaboration and discussion with Russia, because Russia is so keen to open up the Northern Sea route and so keen to exploit its potential resources in the Arctic that it's willing to engage bilaterally and multilaterally through international fora on various issues of the Arctic. And I think one of the reasons we've seen development of the Arctic Council, the passing of two binding decisions by the Arctic Council, is partially because Russia is willing to agree to these otherwise slightly restrictive decisions. So I think the opportunity exists, but Rasmussen has specifically stated that NATO will not have a greater role in the Arctic, and there is disagreement amongst various NATO states about whether NATO should be involved in the Arctic whatsoever. Norway is very keen for a stronger NATO presence, Canada very much less so, and the US is, one might say, indifferent about the issue. So while the opportunity exists, I personally in the short term certainly don't see much opportunity for NATO to increase its presence, and NATO has various other things that it needs to worry about as well. On the issue of ice capability costs, it really depends on to what level your ship is strengthened, and there will be greater clarity on this with the IMO's Polar Code, which has been very delayed but will be forthcoming and will tell us exactly what you need to have on your ship to qualify for various levels of ice strengthening. But in terms of shipping in the high north, one of the issues may not just be the cost of ice strengthening your ship, because those costs will be passed on incrementally to those that are hiring the ship at any one time, but actually the renting of icebreakers for large parts of the year, particularly through the Northern Sea route, because the cost of having an icebreaker, even if you're in a convoy, can be relatively prohibitive, and you might be looking at doubling your cost of passing through any particularly icy patches of water because of that.
Yeah, I'd just point out that the current Russian regulations, although I think they have made one or two exceptions, require you to be at least Polar Class 6, even with icebreaker escort, to operate the Northern Sea route. But I think that to that level, the differences in costs aren't particularly significant compared to other factors that affect the economics of it. But as you get, as Christian said, it tends to go up exponentially as you go higher and higher up the polar classes. As far as the degree of expertise and experience operating in Antarctica. Yes. I'd just point out a couple of things. One is that all the icebreakers that are operating in the Arctic tend to spend the summer operating in the Antarctic. I mean, they're not sitting there for 6 months of the year doing nothing. So we saw the events going on with the scientific expedition that got stuck in the drift ice down in Antarctica, and it was the same Chinese icebreaker that visited Iceland and transited the pole that was down there trying to rescue them. The American icebreaker that Christian talked about with regard to the Arctic was down in the Antarctic for the Southern Hemisphere summer. So the countries that have operating experience in the Antarctic also have operating experience in the Arctic. The ones who are doing research down in the Antarctic tend to be the ones who are doing research in the Arctic, and for a lot of the same reasons. But there are some big differences. I mean, the challenges in the Arctic are, the infrastructure challenges and stuff are more in terms of operating on the ice, flying aircraft in and engineering on the ice, and that's somewhat different from what we'll see in the Arctic, especially as the ice disappears and the permafrost on land starts to disappear. So it's not, those differences are significant as well.
Thank you. Gentleman right at the back, please. And then SEVT.
Thank you. Dr. Bank at Copenhagen University. I have a factual comment and question and factual sort of comment too. I think as to the Danish lack of Coast Guard, it is the Danish Navy who have the Coast Guard role in Greenland and had it for the last 500 or 400 years. So, and I can tell you that at the moment this is the main interest and where the money will come from new ships. That is precisely to take this Arctic task up. I must also bring a confession in this kind of strategic political environment. I'm an international lawyer, and I think there are two issues which are normally glossed over in the discussion. That's the legal status of both the Northeast and the Northwest Passage. I think there's no doubt, except in some kind of there's no doubt that the Canadian argument has a very good argument for the northwest route is part of Canadian internal waters, unless you want to change current international law. Russia has a much more sophisticated legal regime, which is partly open, but they have placed their baselines precisely where the international shipping normally would be allowed to go through, but by placing baselines, they actually created internal waters on some key points. And I think especially the way that Russia handled Greenpeace shows that not only does Russia have the will, but they also know the international rules quite well. They acted precisely within precisely within the existing rules, perhaps in a much more aggressive way that many other states in the Arctic would do it, but they were sort of within proper international law. And as an international lawyer, I was very pleased to see someone finally daring to use the law as it was meant to be used. But so there are some issues, and there are, especially Canada has a problem, but they have the best legal argument. And Russia has a more sophisticated argument, but they have much more political will and power to sort of deny foreign shipping to the access. And this was my factual comment question. So could you imagine that legal questions, which, and I think that's quite interesting if you see the Arctic Council report, they say all legal problems should be solved by the Law of Sea Convention. And that is more or less nonsense, because the Law of Sea Convention will only apply to the continental shelf extension, and only as long as the states get what they want under the Law of Sea Convention. The EU has a much more sophisticated approach. In their sort of Arctic Council, Arctic policy, they said legal conflicts should be solved, which is a correct question, the correct proposition, by the Law of the Sea Convention and customary international law. And the question of access to the Canadian waters, that's under customary law. It's international water. Internal waters are not solved in the Law of the Sea Convention. Russia has a very interesting argument of internal waters, which are not under the convention, and also by historical waters, which sort of, there's always have been a conflict between the more aggressive, legal thinking of Russia and the Arctic policy. So, yeah.
Thank you. Two questions at the front, please.
Dr. Damien de George from Arctic Consensus in Denmark. You talked about the geopolitical competition related to Greenland. Did you touch upon in your book about Greenland's development with regards to Denmark and the EU? Thank you.
Hi, Alan Kessel. I'm currently the Deputy High Commissioner for Canada in the UK, but spent the past 8 years as the Assistant Deputy Minister, Legal Affairs, dealing with the extension of the continental shelf for Canada, and obviously with respect to our other friends in the area. Just a couple of myths and realities that need to be sorted out. The Arctic 8 versus the Arctic 5, I think sort of a kind of a straw man discussion. The only reason there's the Arctic 5 is because those are the countries around the Arctic Ocean who have a legal right to extend their continental shelves. It doesn't mean that it's some exclusive club. It just means that Sweden and Finland and Iceland are just geographically not there, so it doesn't make sense to invite them to that discussion. There was some reference to the Ilulissat Declaration. The Ilulissat Declaration, as many of you will know, was designed as a way to counter the sort of the mismessaging in the media. There was this constant nattering on about race for resources and potential for massive altercations. And what the countries in that area decided to do was to say, get a grip. And at the level of foreign minister, we're going to tell you we have an international legal framework. We've agreed not to go to war with each other, and we will sort out our problems peacefully. And just on the issue of Russia and the North Pole and the reference to Canada's deposit of our extension request, there is no illusion amongst any of the 5 of us in the Arctic Ocean that there will be overlaps. It's provided for in the Law of the Sea Convention. So that's delineation. And the difference between delineation and delimitation is when you can delineate by scientific means to show where the lines are you are entitled to, but delimitation is the negotiation by which you decide how not to bump into each other afterwards. And we've all agreed to work with delineation. So there may be 3 countries looking at the North Pole at the moment, but at some point that patch of water will be dealt with under the normal processes. With respect to the polar code, we're looking forward to it, and we want a binding polar code. Anybody who's in the shipping business or in the insurance business, because right now Lloyd's is determining who goes through the Northwest Passage and other places. And just finally, we're open for business, so as long as you conform to our environmental and safety standards, do come on down.
Thank you. Jeff.
Thank you very much. I'll start with Mr. Kessel's comments, but a couple of those comments had to do with the law of the sea, so I'll talk about that in general. But first of all, the distinction or the difference between the A5 and the A8, I would agree with you, but I think at the time that the A5 were meeting, there was a perception, not necessarily reality, but a perception that this was an attempt by the 5 coastal states to take the Arctic for themselves. And it's true, they are the only ones that have coastlines in the Arctic Ocean, so they're the only ones that really have to face these issues. But in fact, the discussion that arose out of this and the Ilulissat Declaration reinforced the Arctic Council and the A8, so it didn't have the effect that many people outside the A5 feared. In fact, it had the opposite effect, and we do discuss that in the book. On the Ilulissat Declaration, I think another aspect of it that was being addressed in terms of the popular narrative was the pressure from some quarters for an overarching Arctic treaty comparable to the Antarctic Treaty, and simply pointing out, and the Declaration specifically points out that there's no need for such a treaty because all the legal issues are covered by the Law of the Sea Convention. Okay, and in turn, I think your comments about the overlap of the potential claims to the continental shelf. Was very careful, and Christian and I discussed this before this event. I was very careful in my wording in the beginning, where I talked about concern about conflict between Russia and China over sovereignty. I didn't say there was a conflict between Russia and China over sovereignty. I said there was concern in some quarters over it. And again, I think this is a question of perception, not just in the popular perception in the media, but also in some governmental circles, and it is a misperception that there are these conflicts. But in fact, the Law of the Sea Convention provides the overall framework to deal with the issues. But on that, and on the question from the first respondent, in terms of the jurisdiction of the law of the sea, we don't, in the book, we don't go at all into evaluating the validity of different claims over interpretations of the law of the sea, the difference between Russia's, Canada's, and America's interpretation of what constitutes international straits. We talk about the potential effects and problems with those differing interpretations, but we don't pass judgment at all on which ones we feel are more valid. But on that, I would just like to point out two factors. One is that these debates aren't restricted to the Arctic, and this goes to what Christian said about how what happens in the Arctic doesn't necessarily stay in the Arctic. Some of these positions with regard to interpretations of UNCLOS in the Arctic are driven not by Arctic issues, but by the impact that interpretation would have in other areas of the world. And you have the problem of, for example, China having a bit of schizophrenic interpretation where they want to interpret UNCLOS one way with regard to the Arctic and a different way with regard to the South China Sea, for example. So these are global, not Arctic issues. And the second thing involves the enforcement mechanisms of UNCLOS. UNCLOS is really, it's been called a constitution rather than a legal code for the Arctic. There are still a lot of gray areas and contrasting interpretations, and in particular, where there are enforcement mechanisms through tribunals and things, for some aspects of it, countries are allowed to opt out of those when they sign the treaty, and Russia specifically did in a number of areas. And in fact, this was their argument when the Greenpeace case came to an UNCLOS tribunal. Russia actually, I don't want to use the word boycott necessarily, but they did not make a submission. They didn't attend the hearings on the grounds that they had opted out of the tribunals as mandatory and binding. The tribunal ruled, of course, that they did have jurisdiction and the Russians were wrong. But this just goes to when we look at the capability of UNCLOS to govern the region going forward, that's all well and good, but if countries, if it has no effective enforcement mechanism, then that may lead to problems further down the line.
Yes, I mean, I would agree with everything Jeff said. On the issue of the Danish Coast Guard constabulary duties being mandated to the Navy, that is true, but I think our point is that there is no specific Coast Guard organisation, which limits the possibilities for constabulary collaboration in any sense, and those discussions that could foster a greater sense of unity and collaboration amongst the various states. And interestingly, the Danish Navy is not the agency that's been given the lead on the 2011 and 2013 agreements that the Arctic Council reached on oil spill and search and rescue. That's been given to civilian agencies instead. So, there is no sense that the various constabulary forces within the region, which could be a great forum for development of cooperation amongst the various states who often don't think in the same way on various issues, will be able to progress because there is no official Coast Guard and the Danish Navy is not the lead agency for those civilian issues. Damien's question on Greenlandic independence, we do talk about that within the book briefly. And I think we mention it really to point out that there are other potential further divisions and complications within the Arctic amongst the A8 and indeed the A5. I mean, if Greenland was to be independent, which much of the Greenlandic population would like to see, you would have a vast country, a huge land area with a very small population, a population that is potentially going to be not overwhelmed, but certainly balanced by a migration influx to deal with the exploitation opportunities within the country, vast economic and mineral exploitation opportunities, but juvenile governmental institutions, and a lot of attention from very large and very well-resourced governments such as China, potentially such as Russia, which will be difficult for most states to deal with, but particularly difficult for a small state in population terms with a young government. And you also have the slight complication that suddenly you have an Arctic state that is not a member of the EU, may not be a member of NATO, even though there is a US base there. So it really complicates those factors and probably sharpens the sense of geopolitical competition that would exist within the Arctic, but not necessarily of military competition. The issue of Greenlandic maritime security, yes, the Danish Navy has responsibility for maritime security, although the 2008 self-government referendum did devolve some security aspects down to the Greenlandic government. The problem is, obviously, the Danish presence in Greenland is very minimal. There's a vast space between Greenland and Denmark. There are ice-strength and patrol vessels that Denmark has commissioned, and one of which is always on patrol off the coast of Greenland. But that is a further expense that the Danish government may be less willing to engage in as Greenland moves closer and closer to independence. So the question there is, who will assume that role for maritime security? And certainly Canadian officials might be justified in thinking that they will be the natural body to which the Greenlanders may turn to because they are simply the closest. So the question of who assumes the role of maritime security in Greenland's EEZ and territorial waters has not yet been answered sufficiently. And on the Deputy High Commissioner's point on A8 versus A5, I mean, I would agree with Jeff in that we talk about this division not because it's particularly significant in terms of a vast range of differences within the various Arctic states, but because it did create a perception, particularly after Ilulissat, ironically, that the A5 were developing norms of interaction and legal recourse that the A8s, well, the other three, were not having input into. So while I don't think that Sweden, Finland, and Iceland think they're being entirely excluded, and while I think the Arctic Council has developed very strongly since Ilulissat in 2008, equally Ilulissat and a subsequent meeting in Canada in 2010 did demonstrate that there are differing motivations amongst the Arctic states, and there are obviously different concerns amongst the A5 than there are amongst the A8.
Did you have a question? Yes, please.
Thank you. My name is Kazutaka Ito, Japanese daily newspaper Saishin journalist. My question is regarding the Arctic Council's acceptance of 6 new states as observers last May. I was in Kiruna, and I remember U.S. Secretary John Kerry saying, "Wow, 50%, more than 50% of global emission coming from U.S. and China," thereby stressing the importance of including China in the forum at least. And so my question is, having some influential Asian nations like China, India, or Japan, would that lead to more competition or rivalry in Arctic area or cooperation? Thank you.
Any others? Right. One question session then. Christian.
I think there's certainly concern that the involvement of various Asian states and non-Arctic states generally will lead to a confusion of responsibilities in the Arctic, a dilution of the influence of the indigenous groups within the Arctic Council and within the Arctic generally, and the potential for greater geopolitical competition, particularly in areas such as mineral exploitation in Greenland. I think with China, the difficulty is that China's, well, there are various issues around China being involved in the Arctic, but one issue is that the proximity of state-owned enterprises in China and governmental policy is always very difficult to differentiate. Chinese government policy has been very friendly towards various states, but it does seem to have targeted particularly those states it sees as being more commercially vulnerable. in Europe over recent years, particularly since the great financial crisis. And there have been vague and differing statements from Chinese academics, particularly those in think tanks, about what China's policy should be, how China should interact with the Arctic states and the Arctic Ocean, how it should push for certain norms around the use of fishing in the Arctic Ocean, for instance, which doesn't necessarily sit comfortably with particularly the A5, who jealously guard issues over regulation and supervision in the Arctic Ocean. So yes, I think there is concern over particularly China's involvement in Arctic affairs, not necessarily as being an observer of the Arctic Council, because there's very limited input that observers have to the Arctic Council, but simply being a greater player within the Arctic. To some extent, one could see the inclusion of Japan, South Korea, India, Singapore as balancing China's interventions in the Arctic Council and the Arctic more broadly, so that it wasn't just China, which had been attempting to gain permanent observership for some time to the AC, as being the sole and very strong Asian voice, but now there is a pan-Asian conglomerate of countries that are seeking to involve themselves in the discussion. The issue of global emissions coming from the US and China, I don't necessarily agree with Secretary of State John Kerry's statement, because it's true that emissions do largely come from the US, China, and the larger countries, but China has not necessarily been willing to limit its emissions, and its behavior in Copenhagen in 2010 demonstrated that it's often willing to sidestep global norms on global emissions reductions, which is an issue that Jeff can probably talk more about. So I don't think that's a particular reason to involve China in the discussion on the Arctic.
We just have one more question, Nicholas McLean.
One point that doesn't seem to come up very much is indigenous peoples, and I wondered if the panel could comment on differing attitudes and degrees of traction that indigenous people have. They seem to have, of course, the key voice in Greenland, significant in Canada. To what extent do they listen to in Russia? There is a circumpolar organization of the indigenous peoples.
Thank you. Jeff, you'll take that and the other as well.
Well, as Christian mentioned, they do, of course, when the Arctic Council was set up, there are 6 different indigenous organizations who have a seat on the Arctic Council, even though they're not voting members. And the concern that we have alluded to is that as you start to expand the number of permanent observers, and if the Arctic Council transitions from a decision influencing to a decision-making body, if that happens, it will weaken the influence of the indigenous peoples. But one thing that I'd like to point out in this context that often gets overlooked is that there is as much or even more difference of opinion and difference of interest among the Arctic indigenous peoples as there is among and within the Arctic states. So it's not a question of the indigenous people versus the Arctic 5 or the Arctic 8, but there's a huge range. And you see this in the debate within Greenland in particular over exploitation of resources and whether we should be granting oil exploration leases. Mining uranium or not is a big issue. But within the First Nations in Canada, there's a huge difference of opinion. Then you have issues of the relationship, not internationally, but between the indigenous groups and the national government, where the relationship in Russia is very, very different than the relationship in Canada. So it's a very complex issue.
Thank you. I'll bring the meeting to a close there. While I have your attention, 2 dates for your diary. 3rd of February, it's Monday next week, my colleague Mark Fitzpatrick, a discussion meeting on assessing the Iranian nuclear deal. That's a 12:30 start, like today's tea coffee from 12. And then Tuesday, the 4th of February, Libya, the Failed Fairy Tale, with Dr. Florence Gaub of the EU Institute for Security Studies. That's a 1 o'clock start, so tea coffee from 12:30. I would like to bring to your attention that the book is actually available for sale downstairs, a cut rate of £8 for today only. I ask you please to join me in thanking both our speakers.